Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you indeed, Joe, for the invitation to be here with you again this year. Delighted to have the opportunity to discuss these very important matters. I think it's really important that people in this country care so much about policing, because I do agree with Conor, and I'm very conscious of the contribution he's made in this area. I do agree with him about the critical importance of a policing service as a bulwark against those who would seek to undermine our democracy. And it is so critical that we have, as he calls it, good policing. And equally, Vicky, who raises very interesting questions, which I look forward to debating, on the precise role that the police authority can play and the constitutional questions that arise in relation to it, which I have been very cognizant of and have been discussing within government and with the attorney. And we're in the middle of bringing that legislation through the Dáil. And Dervla, thank you for your introduction. I do notice, Joe, that yesterday you did interesting concepts emerge in summer schools. And I do notice that yesterday you did manage to find a champion here in Glenties for the voiceless young men of Irish politics in the person of Frank Flannery. And, of course, we've been focusing quite a lot this year on the women who need to be in the political system, given that we only have 15% representation. And since the foundation of the state, I think, have had 15 women in cabinet compared to, I think, is it 452 men. And we have a long way to go in terms of that unfinished democracy as far as women are concerned. But as I say, interesting concepts do emerge, and no doubt we'll have a few more in the course of the week's deliberations here. The topic that we're discussing here is reform, and I'm going to take a broad approach, and then I'm sure in the questions and answers and the discussion we will be looking in detail at some of the points that have already been made by Conor and by Vicky. You all know the old question and answer. Question, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer, in very thin slices. I would propose to you that the same question and answer applies to reform. The temptation, if you are hungry for reform, and we all should be hungry for reform, is to try and do it all at once in one big swallow. It never works that way. Reform needs to be in manageable chunks, I would suggest, but it also needs to be a continuum. I don't think it's about one big bang reform. I think it's not. We will lay down all the rules for everything and then we will be set and we just move on. The problem with that approach is that, irritatingly, not even the most idealistic, not even the most determined, not even the most energetic reformer can control the external context. The world outside the reform keeps going at breakneck speed, as we well know in the justice area. And just when the reform seems to have solved all past problems, up comes quite another set of challenges. I believe that this is one of the lines of separation distinguishing politicians who are in it for the long haul and politicians who flame out quickly. It is not that either one is better than the other. It is that the long-haul politicians, and I would suggest that Taoiseach Enda Kenny may be the definition of that, actually achieve more over time, because they know that context is always changing. And because they know bad politics lies in solving yesterday's problems, good politics lies in solving today's problems, but great politics lies in preventing tomorrow's problems. I think the continuum of change is particularly important in the legal environment and very interesting to reflect on. Ireland's justice and policing systems are deeply rooted, which does give both great purchase, but it also means that both operate in many ways in a traditionally conservative zone. Many things are done largely the same way as they have been done for centuries. Some areas that may be right and proper. In others, it does not work at all because the context has changed so completely. And what that adds up to is that reform must not just be constant, it must have other characteristics attached to it as well. I think we sometimes look on reform in a self-righteous, punitive way. We are the good guys, everyone else are the bad guys, and the key thing to do is to find them and punish them. A reform, in my view, needs to start with a scrutiny that needs to set out to catch what people are doing right, as well as catching and observing and dealing with what people are doing wrong. The Toland report, which has been mentioned a number of times, for example, which I initiated, and it was the first time, I think, for a very long period that there had been a detailed, objective analysis of the Department of Justice. It did highlight core strengths in the department, including the willingness, flexibility and can-do attitude of many loyal staff, one on which I have relied on myself, I have to say, over the past year. And when you look at the output of the Department of Justice with its wide areas of responsibility and the scale and scope of legislation which we have been responsible for in the last year, you begin very clearly to see that I do indeed need to be able to rely on skill and expertise and willingness and can-do attitude in staff, and to specialist knowledge and expertise within the Department of Justice, which I would want to acknowledge here today. It certainly exists, and I've seen it firsthand. Of course, it also found weaknesses that required addressing, which we did. We have certainly, reform, as Dervla says, does not happen overnight, but we have certainly begun, and I don't say this in a defensive way, just to outline that the Department has taken that report and begun to look at the short, the medium and the longer term recommendations that would make a difference to how we do our businesses. And new practices have been introduced. I'm not going to go into a list of them here, but the idea was to get more robust management, clearer management and better oversight of all the agencies in the sector, which used to be there before but seemed to have disappeared over a period of time, where there wasn't the kind of oversight and engagement between the department and individual agencies with clear outlines of responsibility and what was expected and expectation from both sides. And that has started again, I'm very pleased to say, and the short-term recommendations in the report have been brought in. I would say that that was being done at the same time, as I've mentioned, that we've had a productive year, one of the most productive years, I would say. I would argue that we are making massive changes. In fact, I would argue, despite what you've heard already, that we are making sea changes to the operation and governance of An Garda Síochána. I would also say that we've made massive strides in inequality, and I will come to those in a minute. I would say that you cannot abdicate executive power. You cannot abdicate a constitutional power given to you under 28(2). I would argue it is the responsibility of government, and indeed of good government, to have the appropriate mechanisms, the appropriate exercise of delegated power with its co-responsibilities for government and a new independent policing authority. And I would say that based on legal advice. I would say it is the best practice. I'm not saying that there aren't areas within the new bill where there can be further discussion, where there are some nuances and areas that can be further teased out in the course of the discussion in the Dáil. But I would say that the general principle which I'm following in terms of establishing the independent policing authority is respectful of 28(2) article in the Constitution in terms of that executive power over policing and security, and I would include both, but also allows for a development of an independent policing authority with important responsibilities, including, for example, the new Code of Ethics, absolutely critical to be produced in the first year, the ability to hire and to fire, which it does have, co-responsibility in a number of areas that have been mentioned, which I see as an equally important part of the development of policing in this country. I don't believe that as a Minister for Justice and as a government we can abdicate that power. I do believe that extremely important work in terms of the development of policing in this country, a new transparency and accountability, a more public face can indeed be provided by the policing authority, with its independent chair, with its 8 members who are being publicly advertised for. And of course there is a role for government, and I would argue that that is an appropriate role for government, and we can go into that in more detail. I would say that the changes in that area, as well as the changes in relation to GSOC, were critical and are critical. But I think they're matched in other areas as well, and I'm just going to broaden out the discussion for a moment here. In terms of initiatives we've taken in the past year that have been very important. I do believe the morale of a force like An Garda Síochána, when there's no recruitment, as there wasn't since 2009, that does have a very bad effect. You only have to think of any organisation yourself. If there's no recruitment into that organisation over a period of years, an organisation doing frontline work like An Garda Síochána, that is going to be very deflating. And to have recommenced Garda recruitment and to be looking forward to 550 new recruits coming out from Templemore is a very important initiative. To be driving new cars that are suitable to deal with the work, the mobile work, I would say, that An Garda Síochána have to do now. If you're dealing with mobile gangs who are involved in burglary around the country, you need proper vehicles, you need investment in those. We've invested 27 million in those. That's an important part of policing and important in terms of people doing their job properly. Let's look at another area. The Child and Family Relationship Bill, probably the most fundamental reform of family law since the foundation of the state. The Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission has been established, as has the Court of Appeal. And I would pay tribute to my predecessor, Alan Shatter, for the work that he did in both of those areas. And I was privileged to be able to take them through the door to finality and see both established. The biggest reform in the Court of Appeal since the 1937 Constitution. Reforming new legislation in a variety of areas, and I just mentioned them very briefly. Tougher sentencing for repeat burglars, because I consider burglary a most extreme crime of intrusion on the person and the home. Victims at the heart of our criminal justice system. Yes, an EU Victims Directive, but legislation that actually will mean a sea change. And again, I would use that word, because I believe the Victims Directive and the legislation we're bringing in here, which I published recently, will really make one of the biggest differences in terms of the experience of those who come into contact with the criminal justice system. And I do acknowledge, as others have here, you know, the pain that people, individuals, have suffered because of their experiences with the criminal justice system. I certainly am very aware of that, not least because of the cases that cross my desk. And we all want to see people getting justice and ensuring that justice is seen to be done. But clearly change is necessary, and there have been failures. And what you want to do, what I want to do, is to ensure that we minimise those failures by any action that I can take. And I think the victims' legislation is a key part of that. Bringing in pre-trial hearings to make courts' proceedings more effective. Tackling child sexual exploitation online. Obviously reducing the length of time that asylum seekers will spend in the protection system. We're the only country in Europe that doesn't have what's called a single procedure. We see the survivors of the Magdalene laundry getting justice at long last, 20 million paid out. It's not just about money, of course, it was about justice and justice being seen to be done. The truth is that there is a huge range of very productive work that has been done in the past year, while at the same time we're trying to address those recommendations around internal culture, leadership and management processes. We've done work with staff, again, not for huge detail here, but if you want to change a culture, you have to work with people, you have to listen to people, you have to work with your staff, a very large staff of over 2,000. And that, as I say, has begun to happen much more. And I would say to you that reform is just not about the what, it's also about the how. How do you do reforms? You can have a new set of structures, you can have a new timeline for meetings, a new set of appointments can be made, but if the rigidity and the crippling, limiting rigidity of the past continues, then what you can have is improvement, but not reform. I would say that since I became minister, I have laid unprecedented emphasis on consultation, on listening, on finding out what people at every level think, and on finding out what those we serve think. And therein, I suggest, lies the politics of the future. In the past, it is fair to say that those who wanted to go into politics and wanted to become ministers saw themselves as taking the big decisions. I hope in future many will see themselves as doing the big consultations, the listening exercises, the working with, as opposed to dictating down. Because politicians are public servants, and we should not forget that. And none of this is an aversion to making decisions. And I do believe, I've mentioned the Taoiseach already, I do believe that the Taoiseach personifies this in many ways, that he listens to people, he quotes the people who talk to him, he does encourage open debate within government, and we do have a logical progression that goes from the thesis to the antithesis to synthesis. And I think, it is a minister's job to make decisions, and decisions have to be made, and they often will vex and dissatisfy a lot of people who make input to the consultation, but that does not invalidate the consultation, and that is the direction in which we should head on all issues, because you will get a better stream of reform if you work in that manner. I want to go back for a moment to the reforms relating to An Garda Síochána, where I believe, as I've said already, we are a quantum leap ahead of where we were last year. We opened up recruitment to international competition for the post of Garda Commissioner and Deputy Garda Commissioner. We expanded the powers and the remit of GSOC. We put new whistleblower protection into law. The new policing authority is on its way. The CEO position has been publicly advertised, with public ads for members of the authority following shortly afterwards. It is a new independent forum for the public oversight of policing services in Ireland. Senior Garda management will report to the authority on the performance of policing services. We have the first chairperson in Ms Josephine Feely, who's here today, who has given huge input and assistance already as we have developed our thinking on the legislation. The selection process is underway so that we can have a panel, an authority in place as the legislation comes through. And we have had a huge amount of consultation in relation to it informally with the Joint Committee on Justice, Defence and Equality and the Cabinet Committee as well. This week I will be in Templemore to oversee the new Gardaí and reserves who are being attested, and I would be saying to them as well that they need to inform the overall thinking of the service. Yes, every member, and I said this last year and was criticised for saying it not here but elsewhere, where I talked to new recruits and said it was important for them to give their opinions. Of course, they must take instruction, must act as part of a team, must undertake tasks without always knowing where that task fits in the totality of an operation. But that is not to say that they must be silent and subservient. They do have insight and energy and idealism, and An Garda Síochána should capture that, as indeed they should capture that from every member of the force. And we have moved, and let's face it, it's not just in this area we've moved. In An Garda Síochána, we have moved from a hierarchical society to a society that is more inclusive, more consultative, and where people are listened to more. If you look at the Garda reserves, we see a new Ireland. We see 62 of our reserves are from 25 different nationalities. And of course, that can inform the development of An Garda Síochána going forward. I've said before that this summer school provides a unique challenge to its speakers, a useful and welcome challenge. It forces us to take the time to look at the assumptions that run beneath public discourse, that run beneath our views on policing, as we're discussing here today. One of the assumptions in relation to An Garda Síochána is that the organisation has a deeply embedded, deeply flawed culture. And I have spoken myself about the need for cultural change, and I would repeat that here today. But I have to say that in many of my own dealings with An Garda Síochána, I have not found the service demonstrating an arrogant or a corner-cutting culture. Does that mean that I think arrogance and corner-cutting does not happen? Of course not, it doesn't. But I do want to say this, and it's a point I want to make in terms of the discussion here today, is that when we elevate bad behaviour, even several instances of bad behaviour, into an all-pervasive culture, it can, and I think it's worth thinking about this, it can be very disempowering for everyone. If a Garda, or more than one Garda, operates in a shoddy or sleazy way, the task is to nail that behaviour, to retrain the individual, take disciplinary action, and make it crystal clear that this will not be tolerated on any instance, and that it's not what we stand for. And here is what we stand for. This is the alternative we stand for. And addressing bad behaviour or inaction is the right and responsibility of any employer, and it is what I would expect and indeed demand from an Garda Síochána. But let us do that. Let us address specific behaviours, specific actions, not roll them up endlessly, and I use the word endlessly, into a big shapeless accusation of flawed culture. Because where change is happening, let us recognise it rather than repeating old mantras. Because I believe if we continually repeat the old mantras without looking at specific issues and identifying where change is taking place, we will not move forward. And let me make it very clear, that is not to say that An Garda Síochána's culture should not, like every other area of Irish public service, be subject to constant reform. It should be, and it must be. And I would say that the new training, for example, that we're seeing in Templemore now, the very serious change that is taking place in relation to the kind of training and supervision. And the Garda Inspectorate report was mentioned earlier. That did suggest very broad change that was needed, not least in ICT, where it is extraordinary to think that in all the years of the Celtic Tiger, An Garda Síochána did not get the ICT system that it needed, which has led to a huge range of problems. Quite extraordinary for me to examine that and bring together the first working group that has comprehensively examined this, and we will address it in the upcoming budget, because it's essential to effective policing to have effective ICT systems that can organise and direct where police, where An Garda Síochána are going to do their operational work, how their rosters are going to be managed, very basic, so on and so forth. I would say, though, that change to culture rarely happens by diktat. They often happen by example. And top management can exemplify change that adds up over time to a better culture. Yeats said that peace comes dropping slow. So does cultural change. We know it when we see it. And as far as An Garda Síochána is concerned, we will be watching out for it. And we all in this room, we all need to be alert for it and questioning when we don't see it. I spoke about equality earlier, and one of the great moments for me this year was standing on a platform in Dublin Castle after the marriage equality referendum came out. I'll tell you something, when you're my height, standing between Miriam O'Callaghan on the one side and Panty Bliss in 5-inch heels on the other is some challenge, not to mention Jerry Adams as well. But what a great day, and what a great result, and what heroic contributions from families and individuals. I think of Ursula Halligan, I think of Tom Kern, the General Secretary of Fine Gael. I think of the very emotional stories that they told about their families' lives. And I would pay tribute again to those who worked in the Office of the Attorney General in my own department, who worked day and night to develop both the successful referendum wording and the Child and Family Relationships Act which preceded it. I was speaking earlier about how reform is done, and not what reform is done. And I would say about that day and about that campaign that it was a great day because it was about more than the what. It was totally about the how that campaign was conducted as well. In advance of the referendum, you had to be struck by how many people expressed the hope that the debate, which was inevitably going to be conducted with passion, would also be conducted with courtesy and mutual respect. For the most part, that is exactly what happened. The debate established a new definition of diversity in Ireland, that fundamental disagreement on fundamental issues is possible without endangering either side. And we could learn from that, I believe. But to go back for a moment to those scenes in Dublin Castle, and all of those people from very young toddlers to pensioners, very relieved, good-humoured and well-behaved. The what of that win was very important. The how of the way it was celebrated, I would say, equally so. We showed the world how far Ireland had come from when it was the Valley of the Squinting Windows, an inward, as we know, very fearful-looking place, often punitive. And we showed that in little more than half a century we had transformed ourselves into a confident, outward-looking nation, rooted in tradition but unrestrained by it. It has been a transformation, but it has also been a reformation. We are pretty good, I would say, in this country at re-examining what we receive by way of a legacy from previous generations, pretty good at identifying the real values embedded within various cultural themes, pretty good at saying we will stand for that value, but you know what? We no longer need that particular manifestation of it, which to me is a good definition of reform and one we can apply to the whole policing area. Continuity of values, but abandonment of outdated expressions of those values and elimination of practices that represent unexamined corruption of those values. I said at the beginning that, like eating an elephant, reform needs to be thinly sliced. I will conclude by stating the obvious. There is always another elephant. There is always new reforms to be made. That is the challenge of politics. That is the challenge we face as a society. But in relation to politics, I would say that's why I am proud, despite the denigration one often gets of politics, to be part of a political system, of a government that is working to improve the situation, the very challenging situation which we faced as a government, and why I, as Minister for Justice, want to continue to work to deliver the reforms that really will make a difference to frontline policing in this country. Thank you very much indeed.